Montana Territory, July 1879. The shovel struck dry earth with a dull thud, and dust lifted around her boots. The sun hung low, casting long shadows across the prairie, and the calf at Georgia Mae Monroe's feet would not rise again. She wiped her brow with the back of her hand, smearing dirt across her temple. Her braids stuck to her neck in the heat and her back ached from digging. But she kept going, jaw clenched, breath ragged. There was no one else to do it. She had buried worse things than a calf. She had buried her husband 2 winters ago, and before that, the first baby who never took a breath. She had learned that when the ground needed opening, no one was coming. The wind shifted, carrying the scent of horses and sweat. A rider was coming down the ridge. Georgia squinted into the light. Whoever it was, he rode like he had all day to get somewhere but no hurry to get there. His horse, a tall bay gelding, moved steady. He reined in about 20 feet from her, boots settling in the dust, and tipped his hat. "Afternoon, ma'am," he said. His voice was low and kind, like creek water over smooth stone. She glanced at the dead calf, then back at him. "Afternoon. You need help?" he asked, eyes sliding to the half-dug grave. She hesitated. It was a grave, not just a hole, that mattered. "No, I've got it." He dismounted anyway. He was tall, lean, sun-browned, maybe 30. Dust clung to his shirt and hat. His eyes were green-sharp, steady, and watching her like he saw more than her dirt and grief. "I'm Gideon Brant," he said. "I was riding back from Miles City. Saw the smoke from your chimney. Figured someone lived out this way." She nodded once. "Georgia Monroe." He stepped closer, not too close, and looked down at the calf. "Bad birthing, cord wrapped around its neck. I tried to turn it, but it was too late." He nodded, then took off his hat and knelt beside the grave. "Let me help with this," he said, wrapping his hands around the shovel handle. Then he looked up, eyes soft. "And the rest of your life, if you'll let me." Georgia blinked. The wind tugged at her skirt. She stared at him like he had spoken in a foreign tongue. "You do not know me," she said. "I'd like to," he answered. She crossed her arms. "You offering to save me?" "No," he said calmly. "I just figure no one should have to bury something alone." Georgia did not speak. After a long moment, she handed him the shovel. They worked in silence, trading off. Dirt turned under the blade. The sun dropped lower. When the grave was done, they laid the calf in carefully. Gideon helped her smooth the earth back over, then stood with his hat in his hand and let her say whatever she needed to say. She did not cry. But when it was done, she turned to him and asked, "You hungry?" "I am," he said. She led him to the house. It was small, weather-beaten, with a porch that sagged and a wood stove that smoked just enough to hint at warmth. Inside, it smelled like flour and coffee and something faintly sweet. She lit the lamp and boiled water. He washed up at the basin without being told. Over supper, steamed potatoes with salt and a bit of butter, and cornmeal biscuits. He told her about his ranch further west near Fort Keogh. No wife, no children. Just him and his brother's old land. He had been riding east to trade horses. "And you?" he asked. Georgia stirred her coffee. "Husband died 2 years back. Fever. I stayed. Someone had to keep the cattle alive." He looked around the small house. "You manage this alone?" "I do." "You got folks nearby?" "Only ones I had were buried in Arkansas." He nodded slowly. "You are strong," she shrugged. "I had to be." He helped her wash the plates. She handed him a towel and he dried them without asking where it went. The silence between them was not awkward. It was something else, thick with things neither yet said. When he left that night, he did not press. He touched the brim of his hat and said, "I meant what I said." She watched him ride into the dark. The next morning, she found a small pile of split firewood stacked neatly near the porch. No note. He came again 3 days later. Brought her a sack of flour, some kerosene, and a tin of peaches. Said he had extra. The third time, he fixed the hinge on the barn door. said he could not stand the way it squealed. Georgia started leaving the lamp burning in the window. One afternoon, late July, he rode up and found her out by the creek, kneeling beside a little boy with a scraped knee and a face full of tears. Gideon dismounted fast. "You all right?" he asked. The boy sniffled. Georgia looked up, hair wild around her face. "This is Oliver," she said. "He is 5. My sister left him with me last fall, said she would come back. She never did." Gideon crouched beside the boy. "That's a scratch," he said gently. "I bet I can fix it." Oliver looked up at him, wide-eyed, and nodded. Gideon tore a strip from his undershirt, dipped it in the creek, and wrapped the scrape. Georgia watched him, something loosening in her chest. Later, while Oliver napped inside, Georgia stood on the porch with Gideon. "You are not just passing through, are you?" she asked. "No," he said. "I came back for you." She studied him. "Why?" He looked at her like it was the simplest thing in the world. "Because you are worth riding back for." She swallowed. The wind moved between them, lifting the edge of her sleeve. "You do not know what you are asking," she said. "I do," he said. "I am not offering to fix everything, just to be here, with you, every day after this one." She stepped closer. "And Oliver, I would be proud to raise him alongside you." She looked down at her hands, then back at him. "I want that," she said quietly. He reached for her hand, and this time she let him. His hand was warm and sure, calloused, steady. The sun dipped behind the ridge, casting them in golden light, and for the first time in years, Georgia felt like she was standing on solid ground, not alone. The next weeks folded into one another like worn pages in a ledger. Gideon kept showing up, never empty-handed, never asking for more than she was ready to give. He brought fence wire once, then a sack of dried apples, and once, when the wind rolled in heavy with black clouds, a strip of canvas to cover the leaky section of roof she hadn't had time to patch. Each time, he worked beside her without needing to be told what came next. Georgia noticed the way Oliver followed him now, small boots trailing big ones, asking things about bridles and stirrups. Gideon answered every question without making the boy feel small, kneeling sometimes to show him knots or how to check a hoof. Oliver had started humming again, under his breath, when he thought no one could hear. One morning, a letter arrived from Helena. Georgia didn't recognize the handwriting or the name on the envelope. It was from a man claiming to be her sister's husband. Said he'd heard his wife went missing and thought she might have come this way. He wanted to know if Oliver was with her. He wrote that he wasn't looking to take the boy, only to know he was safe. Georgia read it twice by lamplight and kept it folded in her apron all day without saying a word. That evening she brought it out to the porch. Gideon sat sharpening a draw knife, the metal rasping in slow, even strokes. "Do you think people can mean well and still leave damage behind?" she asked, eyes on the horizon. He paused, set the blade down. "I think most people don't see the full weight of what they leave behind." She handed him the letter. "He says he's not coming for Oliver, just wanted to know he's safe." Gideon read it, then folded it careful and gave it back. "What do you want to do?" "I want to tell him Oliver's here, that he's fed and growing and laughs sometimes. But I don't want him stirring up anything that'll unravel the boy." "Then say only that. No more, no less." She nodded, fingers curling around the paper. "I've never had someone to ask before, about choices. You've always had to decide alone." "That's heavy." "I'm tired of heavy." He looked at her then, not soft, not hard, just real. "You don't have to carry it like that anymore." That night, while Oliver slept with one foot slung out from under the quilt, Georgia wrote a letter with steady fingers. She kept it factual, clean. When she finished, she leaned back in the chair and let her hands rest in her lap. Gideon watched her from across the room, his boots off, shirt sleeves rolled to the elbow. "You ever miss Fort Keogh?" she asked. "Not much to miss." Most days I was just keeping things from falling apart. She smiled faintly. Sounds familiar. He tilted his head. What about Arkansas? You ever think of going back? No one's waiting there. She stood and moved to the window, watching the wind move through the grass. This land holds more of me now than that place ever did. He crossed the room slowly. So what do you want this place to hold next? She turned to face him. A life. That doesn't feel like waiting for the next loss. He didn't reach for her, just stood close enough she could hear his breath. You think I could be part of that kind of life? I think you already are. She didn't flinch when he stepped forward. When his fingers found hers, they folded together like they'd done it 100 times. They didn't kiss. Not yet. But the space between them felt full, waiting only for the right moment. The next morning, Gideon brought his horse to the barn and asked if he could stable it there for a while. Said he'd be staying through harvest. Georgia didn't answer right away. She led him to the fields instead, where the wheat was yellowing and the ground cracked in long lines. She pointed to the north fence. If you're staying, you'll help mend that line first. Elk broke through last storm, he grinned. I'll get the tools from the wagon. And just like that, the rhythm shifted. They worked in tandem through August, days stretched wide with labor and quiet understanding. Gideon taught Oliver how to throw a lasso. Georgia showed Gideon where the soil was richest for planting in spring. One evening, she found him oiling the hinges of the cellar door, unasked, and something warm settled in her chest that didn't have a name yet. When the first leaves turned gold at the edges, she looked across the table at him while Oliver counted seeds in a tin and said, "You ever think about building something more permanent?" Gideon wiped his hands on a rag. Like what? A lean-to off the house, for storage, or maybe another room. He met her eyes. I'd build you a whole second floor if you asked. She laughed quietly, and the sound stayed in the room long after. That night, with the wind soft through the window and the moon silvering the floor, she reached for his hand again. This time, she didn't let go. By September, the frost edged the morning grass in white, and the cattle grew restless with the shifting air. Georgia pulled on her wool shawl before dawn and watched the sun rise in thin streaks over the ridge. Inside, Oliver stirred under quilts, his breath soft and even. She left the door cracked so the warmth could drift back in. Gideon was already in the barn when she stepped outside, pitching hay with his sleeves rolled to the elbow. He didn't speak right away, just nodded toward the mare that had foaled late in the season. The colt was steady now, legs strong enough to test the fence line. Gideon had built a new pen 2 days earlier without being asked. "You think he'll make it through winter?" she asked, watching the colt nuzzle its mother's flank. "He's got grit," Gideon said. "Takes after you." She didn't answer, but her mouth softened at the corners. She hadn't always known what to do with praise. Later, while Oliver stacked kindling near the stove, Georgia packed a small basket with cured meat and sour biscuits. The neighbor to the south, old Mr. Harlan, had sent word through the mail rider that his hip was bothering him again. Georgia hadn't seen him since spring, and the man had no kin nearby. "I'll ride out there," Gideon offered as she latched the basket shut. "He's not one for company," she said. "But he won't turn away food." Gideon leaned against the doorframe. "You think he'd take to me?" She looked up. "If you bring him dried apples, maybe." He took the basket and kissed her temple without ceremony. It was the first time, and she stilled beneath his touch. Eyes closed just a moment longer than the kiss lasted. He didn't wait for a response and was gone before she moved again. With the house quiet, Georgia sorted through the bottom trunk in the bedroom. She hadn't opened it since the spring Oliver came. Inside were folded linens, a small Bible with her mother's name inked inside, and beneath that, a tin box of papers and receipts. She took out the deed to the land, ran her fingers over the notary seal and set it aside. There was another paper beneath it, her marriage certificate from Arkansas, creased and yellowing. She stared at it, then folded it clean and slid it back into the tin. By the time Gideon returned, the sun had dipped low enough to throw long shadows across the porch. He handed her the empty basket and a folded note. "He says he'd take more of those biscuits if you're looking to get rid of them," Gideon said. "And he asked who the hell taught me to ride like that." Georgia chuckled, real and unguarded. "You tell him it was my doing. I told him I was born in the saddle, but I'd ask my wife if she approved." She looked at him, still holding the basket in both hands. "Is that what I am now?" I figured we were both too stubborn to dance around it any longer. She stepped off the porch and stood in front of him, the air between them cool and still. "I want it said plain," he nodded. "I want to marry you, Georgia Mae Monroe, not out of saving, not out of pity. Because I want to wake up beside you every morning until we're too old to climb the stairs." She looked down at her boots, then up into his face. "Yes," she said, "but I don't want ceremony or fuss, just the saying of it and the doing. Then we'll do it quiet. Just us and the boy." Oliver came outside then, rubbing his eyes. "Why are you standing so still?" he asked. Gideon crouched and held out a hand. "You think it'd be all right if I stayed for good?" Oliver blinked, then nodded. "Mama keeps the coffee too strong." "You can fix that. I'll do my best." Georgia wrapped her arms around them both. That night, while the stove crackled and the wind picked up against the window panes, they sat shoulder to shoulder at the table. Gideon reached for Georgia's hand beneath the wood surface, and she let him keep it there. No one said anything more about weddings. But the next day, Gideon brought a single gold ring from his mother's trunk, and Georgia slid it on without hesitation. Nothing else changed. And yet everything did. By early October, the wind came down from the north in sharper gusts, and the horses stood with their backs to it, heads low. The wheat was fully cut, the stalks bundled and stacked, and the barn loft filled near to bursting. Georgia had begun sewing heavier quilts by lamplight when the evening settled early and quiet. She sat on the porch one afternoon, mending a sleeve of Oliver's shirt, when she heard the wagon before she saw it. The creak of wheels and the uneven rhythm of hooves on gravel pulled her gaze up the lane. A single-horse rig rolled into view, and beside the reins sat a woman, narrow-shouldered and wrapped in a faded blue shawl. Her face was thin, sun-marked, and her eyes darted up toward the house like she wasn't sure if she'd be welcome. Georgia rose slowly, cloth still in hand. The wagon stopped, and the woman called out, voice dry from dust. "You Georgia Monroe?" "I am." The woman climbed down stiffly and looked past her toward the barn. "I came for the boy." Georgia didn't move. "You'll need to say more than that. I'm his mother." The wind blew the woman's hair across her face, and she brushed it back with trembling fingers. "My name's Lena. I left him here last fall. I was sick, thought I'd die before winter. I didn't write because I wasn't sure I had the right to." Georgia's fingers dug into the fabric in her hands. "He's safe here. You were gone a long time." "I know," Lena said, "but I'm well now. I've got a place in Billings, sewing work, a room with a stove and enough to keep him fed. I came to ask." Gideon stepped out from the barn then, wiping his hands on a rag. His face was unreadable as he took in the scene. He didn't speak, only stood beside Georgia. Lena's eyes flicked to him, then back. "You married?" Georgia nodded once. Lena looked down at the dirt between her boots. "He doesn't know me anymore, does he?" "He remembers you," Georgia said, "but he doesn't talk about that day." "I don't blame him." Georgia turned toward the house. "He's inside. You can see him." Lena hesitated, then followed her in. Gideon didn't go with them. Inside, Oliver sat at the table sorting nails into tins. He looked up when the door opened. His eyes moved from Georgia to the woman behind her. She crouched slowly. "Hey, baby." Oliver froze. "You're not coming back," he said. Lena blinked and her voice caught. "I didn't think I could, but I want to now." He stood up. "I don't want to go to a room. I want to stay with Mama and Gideon." Georgia's breath hitched, but she didn't interrupt. Lena looked at her. "He calls you Mama." "I didn't ask him to." Lena stood. "I won't drag him if he doesn't want it." Georgia studied her. "You sure?" "I brought a letter for him. He can read it when he's older. I just wanted him to know I didn't forget." She pulled a folded page from her coat and set it on the table. "I'm not a good woman," she said, "but I'm trying to be better." Georgia nodded slowly. "That counts for something." Lena left without asking for a meal or water. Georgia watched the wagon disappear down the road until the dust settled back into the earth. That night, after Oliver was asleep, Gideon came in from locking the barn. He pulled off his coat and hung it by the door. "She leave for good?" he asked. "I think so." He crossed the room and sat beside her at the hearth. The fire burned low. "She didn't try to take him," she said quietly. "She saw he already had a home." Georgia leaned against him, her head resting on his shoulder. "I didn't know what the right thing was." "I still don't. You did what was kind. That's enough." His hand found hers, fingers threading together. Outside, the wind shifted again, but inside the house the heat held steady. The quilts were stacked, the pantry full, and there was nothing left unfinished between them. When they went to bed, they left the door between the rooms open. Not from fear or need, but because there was no longer anything to guard against. In the dark, Gideon whispered something low, meant only for her. She turned toward him, eyes open in the quiet. "Yes," she said. "I do too." The snow came early that year, quiet and heavy, blanketing the land in a hush that softened even the creak of the barn doors. By mid-November, the world beyond the fence lines had turned white and still. The cattle huddled close to the windbreak, and smoke curled steady from the chimney each morning, a sign that the house was warm and lived in. Inside, the days took on their own rhythm, bread rising near the stove, Oliver tracing letters at the kitchen table, and Gideon carving notches into fence posts by the hearth when the snow piled too deep to work outside. The house no longer felt like something Georgia had to defend. It felt earned. Gideon sat at the table one evening, a piece of cedar in hand, knife moving slow and deliberate. Georgia glanced over from the wash basin, wiping her hands on a cloth. "You carving something for the boy?" she asked. He shook his head. "For you." She stepped closer, drying her hands. "What is it?" He held it up. A small box, smooth-edged and fitted at the corners. "Thought you'd need somewhere to keep things that matter." She ran her fingers gently across the lid. "I've never had anything made just for me." "Now you do," he said. "And it's built to last." Later, when the fire had settled to a low glow and Oliver was curled up with his quilt tucked to his chin, Georgia placed the letter Lena had left inside the box, along with the deed and the gold ring Gideon had given her. She closed the lid slowly, her hand lingering there. The next morning, the roof groaned under the weight of fresh snow. Georgia opened the door and blinked at the brightness, then stepped back as a gust swept through. Gideon appeared behind her, wrapping his coat around her shoulders. "Woodpile's low," he said. "I'll take the sled down to the grove." She nodded. "I'll keep the coffee warm." He leaned down and kissed her cheek, slow and full of quiet promise. Then he stepped into the snow, pulling the sled behind him. Hours later, the house was warm again, the stack by the stove replenished. Georgia sat mending Oliver's winter socks. The boy nestled near her, humming tunelessly under his breath. Gideon joined them with a mug in hand, the scent of pine still clinging to his coat. Georgia glanced at him. "You ever think of adding on to the barn?" He raised a brow. "That a hint?" She smiled. I figure if we're staying, we'll need more room, maybe for a second milk cow come spring. He reached across the table, his fingers brushing hers. Whatever you want built, we'll build it. She held his gaze. I want to build a life, not just keep surviving. You already are, he said. And I'm grateful every day you let me be part of it. Winter deepened. The days shortened and the nights turned sharper, but inside the house, time moved gently. Georgia taught Oliver how to stitch a button and Gideon showed him how to read a map. When the first thaw came in March, the roof began to drip, and the ground softened enough for puddles to form. By April, the three of them rode into Miles City together, Georgia on her mare, Oliver bundled in front of her, and Gideon leading the wagon. They sold the extra hides, picked up a new kettle and a sack of oat seeds, and stopped by the county clerk's office. The man behind the desk looked up when they entered. Georgia stepped forward and set the paper down. We'd like to register our marriage, she said. The clerk nodded and handed her the pen. Gideon signed after her, his hand steady. When it was done, Georgia turned to him. No fuss, she said. No fuss, he agreed, but his hand found hers as they stepped back out into the sun. They returned to the homestead with the wagon bed full and the sky wide above them. The fences held, the fields waited, and the house stood strong against the rise. Years passed, marked by seasons instead of calendars. Gideon built the barn addition in the spring after Oliver turned 7. Georgia planted lilacs along the fence line and sewed curtains for the front windows. They added a second room when the boy grew taller and started asking questions about the stars. Gideon taught him how to track by moonlight, and Georgia taught him how to listen when the wind changed. On their 10th spring together, Oliver carved his initials into the porch rail beside theirs. The lilacs bloomed full that year, and the house smelled of earth and honey through every open window. One evening, Georgia stood at the edge of the field, watching the wheat sway low in the light. Gideon came to stand beside her, his hand resting at the small of her back. You ever think about how far we've come? He asked. She nodded. I think about it every day. He pressed a kiss to her temple. If I had to choose again, I'd still ride up that ridge. She leaned into him. And I'd still hand you the shovel. They stayed like that as the sun dipped below the horizon, the land quiet, the house glowing behind them. They had built something enduring, not out of ease but out of choice, and it held.